They called her too emotional for bomb disposal work, said she'd freeze when lives hung in the balance. But when a device with enough explosive power to level half of downtown Brussels was counting down its final seconds, Sarah Chen became the only person standing between thousands of innocent people and catastrophe. What happened in those last moments would change everything they thought they knew about courage under pressure. The morning sun streamed through the reinforced windows of the Brussels Counter-Terrorism Unit's training facility. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Casting long shadows across the mock explosive devices that lined the practice tables. Sarah Chen arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, 30 minutes before the mandatory briefing, clutching her third cup of coffee and a dog-eared manual on advanced detonation mechanisms. At 23, Sarah possessed an unusual combination of traits for someone in explosive ordnance disposal training. She was brilliant. Her theoretical scores consistently topped her class. She was dedicated, often the first to arrive and last to leave the facility. But she was also, in the words of her instructors, emotionally reactive. When faced with high-pressure scenarios, she would furrow her brow, bite her lip, sometimes even tear up when discussing particularly devastating case studies. Bomb disposal is about ice in your veins, Chief Inspector Henrik Larsson would often say during briefings, his weathered face serious as granite. One trembling hand, one moment of panic, and you're not just dead, you've potentially killed everyone in a 6-block radius. Sarah understood the stakes better than anyone. Her fascination with explosive ordnance had begun during her engineering studies at KU Leuven, where she'd written her thesis on the mathematical precision required to neutralize complex timing mechanisms. But understanding something intellectually and performing under pressure were, according to everyone around her, two entirely different things. The training facility buzzed with its usual pre-session energy. Mock bombs of varying complexity sat arranged on metal tables like deadly puzzles waiting to be solved. Sarah made her way to Station 7, where a practice device simulated a timer-based explosive with multiple redundant triggers. She'd requested this particular setup 3 times over the past month, drawn to its intricate wiring patterns and the precise sequence required for safe disarmament. Starting early again, Chen? The voice belonged to Marcus Hoffman, a 30-year-old former military explosives expert who joined the civilian unit 6 months ago. Where Sarah was methodical and careful, Marcus was confident and quick. Where she showed emotion, he maintained perfect composure. He was, in every measurable way, exactly what their instructors wanted in a bomb disposal specialist. Just reviewing the sequencing, Sarah replied, her Belgian accent softening the English words. She pointed to the device's exposed wiring. The manufacturer's manual suggests a different approach than what we practiced yesterday. If you isolate the power source here first, rather than here, you eliminate the risk of triggering the backup detonator. Marcus leaned over the device, studying her analysis. Interesting theory, but in the field, you don't have time for theoretical approaches. You need to trust your training and move fast. Overthinking kills people. This was the fundamental divide that separated Sarah from her peers. They saw speed and confidence as the ultimate virtues. She saw precision and understanding as paramount. They viewed her careful analysis as dangerous hesitation. She viewed their rapid responses as reckless shortcuts. Chen Hoffman over here. Chief Inspector Larsson's voice cut across the training room. The morning briefing was beginning, and with it, another day of being reminded why emotional people shouldn't handle explosives. The assembled trainees formed a semicircle around Larsson's demonstration table. Today's lesson focused on pressure-sensitive devices, bombs designed to explode if handled incorrectly, if moved too quickly, or if the person attempting disarmament made any sudden movements driven by panic or fear. These devices are psychological. Weapons as much as physical ones, Larson explained, his hand steady as he indicated various components. They're designed to make you nervous, to make you second-guess yourself, to make you rush. The bomber wants you afraid because fear makes you sloppy. Sarah took notes meticulously, sketching the device's layout and annotating potential approach strategies. Around her, other trainees nodded along, but she noticed their attention wandering as Larson delved into technical specifications. Sarah absorbed every detail, every warning, every piece of advice as if her life depended on it, because someday it would. For this week's practical assessment, Larson continued, each trainee will be assigned a mock scenario. You'll work in pairs, with one person serving as the primary technician and the other as support. The scenarios are based on real cases from our files, so treat them with appropriate seriousness. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as Larson began reading assignments. This was what she'd been working toward for months, a chance to prove that her careful, methodical approach could work under simulated pressure. Hoffman and Weber, you're handling the shopping center scenario. Davidson and Kumar, the airport device. Chen ... Larson paused, consulting his clipboard. You're on equipment, inventory, and scenario documentation. Make sure all devices are properly reset after each exercise. The familiar sting of disappointment hit Sarah like a physical blow. Once again, she was relegated to support duties while others got hands-on experience with the challenging scenarios. She watched as her classmates exchanged excited grins and began discussing their assigned cases, while she was left holding a clipboard and a checklist of equipment to track. Sir, Sarah said, raising her hand slightly, I was hoping to request consideration for a primary technician role. My theoretical scores have been— Chen, Larson interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. Technical knowledge is important, but field work requires a different kind of stability. We need people who can stay calm when every second counts. The unspoken message was clear. She was too emotional, too prone to visible stress, too likely to crack when lives hung in the balance. Sarah nodded and accepted her assignment, but inside, a familiar fire began to burn. She would prove them wrong. She just needed the right opportunity. As her classmates began their practical exercises, Sarah methodically documented their approaches, noting what worked, what didn't, and what she would do differently. Because despite what everyone believed about her emotional unsuitability for high-pressure work, Sarah Chen had been preparing for a moment they couldn't imagine, a moment when careful analysis and emotional intelligence would matter more than bravado and speed. She just didn't know that moment was less than 2 weeks away. The pattern began subtly, as these things often do. 3 days after the practical assessment, Sarah submitted a detailed analysis of the training scenarios she'd observed, complete with alternative approaches and efficiency improvements. Report was thorough, well-researched, and demonstrated an understanding of explosive devices that surpassed most of her peers. Chief Inspector Larson filed it without comment. The following week brought news of an opening in the unit's rapid response team, an elite group that handled the most dangerous, time-sensitive cases across Belgium and neighboring countries. Sarah had been hoping for this opportunity since joining the program, knowing that the rapid response team represented the pinnacle of bomb disposal work. Hoffman, Larson announced during morning briefing, you're being transferred to rapid response effective immediately. Your performance in last week's scenarios demonstrated exactly the kind of decisive action we need in critical situations. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Marcus had completed his assigned scenario successfully, but his approach had been textbook standard, efficient but unremarkable. She documented several moments where his confidence had led to unnecessary risks, shortcuts that worked in training, but might prove dangerous in real-world applications. After the briefing, she approached Larson privately. Sir, I'd like to be considered for future rapid response openings. I believe my analytical approach could complement the team's existing Strengths. Larson studied her with the patient expression of someone explaining something to a child. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chen, your technical knowledge is impressive, but rapid response work isn't about analysis. It's about making split-second decisions under extreme pressure. The kind of pressure that makes people emotional, makes them hesitate, makes them second-guess themselves. Sir, with respect, emotion doesn't automatically mean panic. Sometimes it means caring enough to get things right. In bomb disposal, getting things right means staying alive and keeping others alive. That requires a very specific kind of personality, calm, detached, able to function when normal people would be paralyzed by fear. Larson's tone wasn't unkind, but it was final. Your talents are better suited to research and analysis roles. Research and analysis. Always research and analysis. Sarah had heard this phrase so many times it felt like a consolation prize. A gentle way of saying she wasn't cut out for the real work. The dismissals continued in small but consistent ways. When guest instructors visited from other European bomb disposal units, Sarah's questions during Q&A sessions were often redirected or abbreviated. "Let's keep this practical rather than theoretical," became a common refrain. When training scenarios involved multiple technicians, she was invariably assigned to perimeter security or equipment management rather than hands-on disarmament work. The most painful incident occurred during a joint training exercise with the French National Police's explosives unit. A complex scenario involved a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device in a crowded area simulation. Sarah had spent hours studying the setup, identifying what she believed was a more efficient approach than the standard protocol. "The primary detonator is here," she explained to her assigned partner, pointing to a concealed trigger mechanism. "But there's a secondary system hidden in the wheel well. If we follow standard protocol and cut the main power source first, we risk activating the backup system." "I think we should disable the secondary system first then, Chen," interrupted Captain Morrison from the French unit, who was observing the exercise. "Are you always this nervous during scenarios? You're overthinking a straightforward disarmament procedure." Sarah realized her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from excitement and having identified something others had missed. However, her visible emotion was immediately interpreted as anxiety. "Perhaps we should have someone else take the lead on this one," Morrison suggested. "Someone who looks more confident about the approach." Sarah stepped back as her partner took over, using the standard protocol she'd warned against. The exercise concluded successfully, but only because it was a training scenario. In a real situation, Sarah knew her approach would have been safer and more thorough. "You need to work on your presentation," her partner advised afterward. "You might know your stuff, but if you look scared, nobody's going to trust your judgment." In a crisis, the criticism stung because it highlighted the impossible position Sarah found herself in. Her careful analysis and emotional investment in getting things right were interpreted as anxiety and indecision. Meanwhile, her peers' confidence, even when it led to suboptimal approaches, was praised as exactly the mindset needed for bomb disposal work. The final blow came during a unit evaluation, meeting that Sarah wasn't supposed to overhear. She'd stayed late to complete equipment inventory when voices from Larson's office carried through the thin walls. "Chen's technical scores are exceptional," she heard Larson saying. "Her understanding of explosive mechanisms is probably the best we've seen in years." "But," came another voice she recognized as Deputy Chief Vanessa Laurent, "but she shows emotion under pressure." Last week's scenario had her visibly stressed, asking multiple questions, second-guessing the standard approach. In our line of work, that kind of emotional response is dangerous. When you're dealing with bombs, you need people who can compartmentalize, who can stay detached even when lives are on the line. So what's the recommendation? Keep her in analysis and training roles. She's valuable for research, for developing new protocols, for teaching theory. But field work? I just don't see it. She cares too much, and that caring manifests as anxiety. In bomb disposal, anxiety kills. Sarah stood frozen in the hallway, holding her inventory sheets and feeling like she'd been punched in the chest. They thought caring was a weakness. They thought her emotional investment in getting things right was a liability rather than an asset. Over the following days, Sarah noticed the change in how others treated her. Conversations would pause when she entered a room, then resume with carefully neutral topics. Training assignments became increasingly focused on documentation and equipment management. When she offered suggestions during scenario debriefs, they were acknowledged politely but never implemented. The message was clear. She was brilliant enough to understand bombs, but not stable enough to defuse them. Sarah began to feel like a ghost haunting the periphery of her own career. She attended briefings where critical cases were discussed, but was never assigned to them. She studied advanced techniques, but was never allowed to practice them. She watched as less knowledgeable but more stable colleagues received opportunities that remained perpetually out of her reach. The worst part was understanding their logic. Bomb disposal was literally life and death work. The margin for error was zero. If emotional responses truly made someone unsuitable for high-pressure situations, then their caution was justified. But Sarah knew something they didn't. Her emotions didn't make her reckless or panicked. They made her more careful, more thorough, more determined to save lives. While others saw confidence and detachment as virtues, she saw them as potentially dangerous. Overconfidence led to shortcuts. Detachment led to missed details. The people she worked with were good at their jobs, but they approached bomb disposal like a technical problem to be solved quickly and efficiently. Sarah approached it like what it truly was, a life or death responsibility that demanded not just skill, but absolute commitment to protecting innocent people. As weeks passed and the pattern of dismissal became entrenched, Sarah made a decision. If they wouldn't give her opportunities to prove herself through official channels, she would create her own opportunities. After her regular duties ended each day, she began staying late to practice on decommissioned devices, studying manuals that went beyond required reading, and developing approaches that prioritize safety over speed. She had no way of knowing that in less than a week, all that preparation would be put to the ultimate test. And when it was, everyone who had dismissed her emotional unsuitability for pressure situations would discover that sometimes the person who cares the most is exactly who you need when everything goes wrong. While her colleagues left the training facility each evening at precisely 5:30 p.m., Sarah Chen had developed a different routine. She would complete her assigned equipment inventory, file her daily reports, and then, when the building grew quiet and shadows lengthened across the practice tables, she would begin her real work. Hidden beneath regulation manuals in her locker was a collection of advanced texts that most bomb disposal technicians never bothered to read. Psychological warfare through explosive devices, advanced timer mechanisms in modern IEDs, and chemical composition analysis for field identification. These weren't required reading. They were graduate-level resources that went far beyond basic training protocols. Sarah had acquired them gradually, ordering them online with her own money, checking them out from university libraries during weekends, even traveling to conferences where she wasn't officially registered, but could attend public sessions. Nobody had asked her to pursue this level of expertise. Nobody knew she was doing it. But Sarah had learned that waiting for permission meant waiting forever. The decommissioned devices in storage, Room B, became her laboratory. These were training bombs that had been retired from active use mechanisms that were too outdated for current scenarios but still functional enough for study. Most trainees avoided them, considering them irrelevant to modern threats. Sarah saw them as a library of techniques that could resurface in new configurations. Every bomber learns from previous designs, she had read in one of her advanced texts. Understanding historical methods provides insight into innovative applications. So while others focused on memorizing current protocols, Sarah was reverse engineering decades of explosive technology, learning not just how to dismantle devices, but how to think like the people who created them. Her evening sessions followed a strict methodology. First, she would examine a decommissioned device without any reference materials, documenting every wire, every component, every potential trigger mechanism. Then she would research the device's history, when it was used, where it was discovered, what techniques had successfully dismantled similar devices in the field. Finally, she would practice multiple disarmament approaches, timing herself and noting which methods were safest versus which were fastest. The most valuable part of her self-directed education came from studying failures cases where bomb disposal attempts had gone wrong. Official training focused on successful techniques and standard protocols. Sarah's private research delved into the disasters, incidents where experienced technicians had made fatal errors, situations where standard approaches had proved inadequate, scenarios where unconventional thinking had been the difference between catastrophe and survival. She discovered patterns that weren't taught in formal training. Many failed disarmament attempts resulted from overconfident technicians who relied too heavily on standard procedures, without fully analyzing the specific device they faced. Others failed because of time pressure rushing through complex procedures rather than methodically working through each step. The successful unconventional approaches often came from technicians who, like Sarah, had been dismissed as overthinking the problem. One case particularly captured her attention. A device discovered in Munich that had stumped German explosive experts for hours. The bomb contained multiple redundant trigger systems designed to activate if standard disarmament protocols were followed. The technician who finally solved it was a junior specialist who ignored established procedures and instead traced the device's wiring from the explosive backward to the triggers, identifying a previously unknown vulnerability in the design. Sometimes the best approach is the one nobody expects, the case report concluded, including the bomber. Sarah began developing her own systematic approach based on this principle. Instead of following linear disarmament procedures, she trained herself to think in reverse, starting with the desired outcome, safe neutralization, and working backward to identify all possible pathways. This method was slower than standard protocols, requiring more analysis and decision-making time. But it was also more thorough, accounting for unusual configurations that might catch conventional approaches off guard. Her colleagues would have been surprised to know that Sarah had essentially created her own advanced training program. While they practiced standard scenarios during official sessions, she was developing expertise in exotic trigger mechanisms, studying chemical composition analysis that could identify explosive types in seconds, and learning techniques for working in extreme time pressure situations. The irony wasn't lost on her that, while everyone considered her too emotional for high-pressure work, she was the only one systematically preparing for scenarios where emotions would be irrelevant, situations so critical that pure technical expertise and methodical thinking would be the only thing standing between success and catastrophe. Sarah's preparation extended beyond technical skills. She had studied psychological profiles of successful bomb disposal specialists, looking for common traits and mental approaches. What she discovered challenged everything her instructors taught about. Emotional detachment. The most successful technicians weren't emotionally detached at all. They were people who channeled their emotional investment into hyperfocus and determination. They cared deeply about saving lives, and that caring drove them to be more careful, more thorough, more willing to take necessary time rather than cutting corners. The failed attempts often came from technicians who approached bomb disposal as a technical exercise rather than a life-saving mission. This research gave Sarah confidence that her emotional nature wasn't a weakness. It was a strength that needed proper channeling. While others saw her visible investment in scenarios as anxiety, she began to understand it as evidence of the exact mindset needed for truly critical situations. By the time 3 months had passed, Sarah had essentially completed an advanced degree in explosive ordnance disposal that no official program offered. She could identify device types by their construction patterns, predict likely trigger mechanisms based on bomber psychology, and execute disarmament procedures that prioritized absolute safety over speed. She had also developed something else that couldn't be taught in any classroom: an intuitive understanding of how bombs were designed to fail bomb disposal attempts. This psychological dimension of explosive devices, the way they were engineered to exploit human assumptions and standard procedures, became her specialty. Sarah kept detailed notes on everything she learned, creating a personal database of techniques, case studies, and analytical approaches that went far beyond anything covered in official training. She organized this information methodically, knowing that if an opportunity ever arose to prove her capabilities, she would need to access her knowledge quickly and accurately. What she didn't realize was that her opportunity was already being constructed by someone with a very different agenda. In a warehouse across Brussels, a person who understood bomb disposal protocols as well as Sarah did was creating a device specifically designed to defeat every standard approach her colleagues had been trained to use. The device was intended to prove that conventional bomb disposal thinking was fatally flawed. And soon, Sarah's unconventional preparation would be the only thing standing between that proof and thousands of innocent lives. Word of Sarah's disciplinary incident spread through the Brussels Counter-Terrorism Unit with the efficiency of a well-designed explosive chain reaction. By the following morning, every trainee, instructor, and administrative staff member knew that Chen had gone rogue during a training exercise, disrupting established protocols and undermining team leadership in pursuit of what she claimed was a better approach. The story, however, had evolved in the telling. What began as Sarah identifying a missed component had become Sarah attempting to take control of an exercise she wasn't authorized to participate in. Her warning about a hidden trigger mechanism became an example of her inability to trust her colleagues' expertise. Her attempt to prevent a potential training failure became evidence of her fundamental unsuitability for collaborative work. I heard she actually tried to override the team leaders, Private Rodriguez whispered to his partner during morning equipment prep. Like she thought she knew better than people with years of field experience. Typical, replied Weber, shaking his head as he checked detonator specifications. Technical types always think they're smarter than operators. That's why they keep her on documentation duty instead of real work. Sarah could feel the shift in atmosphere every time she entered a room. Conversations would pause, then resume in carefully neutral tones. Colleagues who had previously been politely distant now avoided eye contact entirely. Her suggestions during briefings, which had once been acknowledged and dismissed, were now met with uncomfortable silence. The most painful change came from the few people who had treated her as an equal. Rachel Morrison, a communications specialist who had occasionally invited Sarah for coffee, now kept their interactions strictly professional. Even Marcus Hoffman, who had at least engaged with her technical observations, began responding to her questions with curt, monosyllabic answers. "Chen," he said after a particularly awkward exchange about device specifications, "maybe you should focus on your actual assignments instead of trying to insert yourself into scenarios that aren't your responsibility." The message was clear. She had crossed a line from being merely unsuitable for field work to being actively disruptive to unit cohesion. Her dedication to understanding bomb disposal beyond her assigned role was now viewed as evidence of poor judgment and dangerous ambition. "Chief," Inspector Larson called her into his office 3 days after the incident, not for formal discipline, but for what he termed a career counseling session. Sarah sat across from his desk, surrounded by commendations and photographs from successful operations she would never be part of. "Chen," Larson began, his tone carrying the weary patience of someone delivering bad news to a child, "I want to be clear about something. Your technical knowledge is impressive, possibly exceptional. But knowledge without judgment is dangerous in our field. Sir, I believe my judgment was sound. The team was about to make a mistake that could have been fatal in a real situation. That's exactly what I'm talking about." Larson leaned forward, his expression serious. "You've convinced yourself that you see things others miss, that your analysis is superior to the collective experience of trained professionals. That kind of thinking is how accidents happen." Sarah felt a familiar frustration building. "Sir." The hidden trigger mechanism was clearly visible from the monitoring station. It wasn't superior analysis. It was a different perspective that revealed information the ground team couldn't access. And if you had been in your assigned monitoring role instead of trying to play tactical advisor, you could have documented that oversight for post-exercise analysis. That's how we improve our procedures, through systematic review, not real-time interventions from people outside the command structure. "But in a real situation," Larson interrupted, "unauthorized communications cause chaos. Bomb disposal teams train extensively to work within clear hierarchies and defined roles. When someone breaks those protocols, even with good intentions, they compromise everyone's safety." Sarah realized she was fighting the same battle she'd been fighting for months, but now the terms had shifted. Previously, she'd been dismissed as too emotional for high-pressure work. Now she was being characterized as too arrogant, too convinced of her own superiority to work effectively with others. "Sir, I'm not trying to undermine anyone. I want to contribute to keeping people safe. I understand that, Chen. But contributing effectively means understanding your role and staying within it. The research division transfer will give you opportunity to contribute without the interpersonal complications that seem to follow you in operational environments." The research division. Sarah had heard this phrase so often it felt like a mantra, a magical solution that would somehow make her inconvenient insights disappear while preserving the fiction that her talents were being properly utilized. Over the following days, Sarah noticed her access to certain materials being quietly restricted. Training manuals that had been available for general checkout now required supervisor approval. Her monitoring station assignments were reduced to basic equipment tracking with limited camera access. Even her after-hours study sessions were curtailed. When building security was instructed to ensure all non-essential personnel left by 6 p.m. "Security protocols," explained Sergeant Williams when Sarah questioned the new restrictions. "We're tightening access to sensitive materials and facilities. Nothing personal." But it felt personal. Every restriction, every redirected question, every polite dismissal felt like evidence that her presence was considered more liability than asset. She was being systematically isolated from the information and access she needed to maintain her expertise, while being told it was for her own good and the good of the unit. The cruelest irony was that Sarah's warning had been proven correct. The post-exercise analysis confirmed that Team Gamma's approach would have triggered the hidden mechanism in a real scenario. But instead of validating her intervention, this confirmation was used as evidence that the system worked. Problems were identified and corrected through proper review procedures, not unauthorized interventions during operations. "The system caught the error," Lauren explained during a staff meeting Sarah was permitted to attend. "Post-exercise analysis identified the oversight and allowed us to update our protocols. This demonstrates why we have established procedures for review and improvement." No mention was made of who had actually identified the error, Or what would have happened if the oversight had occurred in a real situation where post-exercise analysis came too late? Sarah's contribution was erased from the official narrative, transformed into evidence that people should trust the system rather than their own observations. By the end of her second week as a pariah, Sarah understood that her colleagues weren't just questioning her judgment, they were questioning her motivations. Her intensive self-study was viewed as evidence of ego rather than dedication. Her emotional investment in getting things right was seen as dangerous instability. Her willingness to challenge established approaches was interpreted as fundamental disrespect for the experience and expertise of others. The transformation was complete. Sarah Chen had evolved from being too small for the job to being too disruptive for the team. But what her colleagues didn't understand was that their systematic exclusion of her perspective was eliminating exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that could save lives when conventional approaches failed, and failure was coming sooner than anyone expected, in a form specifically designed to exploit the very certainties and protocols that her colleagues defended so vigorously. The bomber who was constructing their device across the city understood that the greatest weakness of any bomb disposal unit wasn't technical, it was psychological. The inability to consider that everything they'd been trained to trust might be exactly wrong. The incident that shattered Sarah's remaining confidence in the system began with what should have been a routine training evaluation. Deputy Chief Laurent had designed a comprehensive scenario intended to test each trainee's readiness for field certification, a mock crisis involving multiple devices and cascading time pressures that simulated the chaos of real bomb disposal emergencies. Sarah had been assigned, once again, to equipment monitoring and scenario documentation. Her role was to track which tools each team used, time their responses, and note any protocol deviations for post-exercise analysis. She sat at a monitoring station equipped with multiple screens showing different camera angles of the training area, clipboard ready, prepared to do her job efficiently and professionally. The scenario began with a simulated terrorist threat at Brussels Central Station. 3 training devices had been planted in different locations, each with varying levels of complexity and different trigger mechanisms. Teams of 2 technicians each would handle the devices simultaneously while command coordinated their efforts. The twist was that the devices were interconnected, disarming them in the wrong sequence could theoretically trigger the remaining bombs. Sarah watched as the teams approached their assigned devices. Team Alpha, led by Marcus Hoffman, quickly identified their device as a standard timer-based mechanism and began following protocol efficiently. Team Beta, composed of 2 recent graduates, tackled a pressure-sensitive device with methodical precision. Team Gamma faced the most complex challenge, a device that appeared to have multiple trigger systems and unconventional wiring patterns. As the exercise progressed, Sarah noticed something troubling. Team Gamma was struggling with their device identification. Through her monitoring equipment, she could see details that weren't visible to the teams on the ground, camera angles that revealed components the technicians couldn't access from their positions. Team Gamma, she heard over the communication system. Status report. Still analyzing, came the reply from Technician Walsh. This configuration doesn't match any of our standard protocols. We're seeing what appears to be a dual trigger system, but the wiring suggests there might be additional components we haven't identified. Sarah leaned forward, studying the monitor. She could see what Walsh was missing, a concealed secondary mechanism that would activate if they followed standard protocol for the visible triggers. The camera angle from above clearly showed additional wiring running beneath the devices, casing that the ground team couldn't see. "Command," Sarah said into her monitoring headset. "I'm seeing additional components in Team Gamma's device that aren't visible from ground level. There's a secondary system that could be triggered if they proceed with standard disarmament." "Chen, your job is observation and documentation," came Laurent's crisp reply. "Not tactical analysis." Ma'am, I understand, but the camera angles show. Chen, maintain your assigned role. Team Gamma has this handled. Sarah watched helplessly as Team Gamma continued their analysis, unaware of the hidden trigger mechanism that her elevated perspective revealed. In a real situation, their approach would have resulted in detonation. She could prevent a training failure and, more importantly, could prevent these technicians from learning a potentially fatal approach, but her input was being dismissed without consideration. Team Gamma, Walsh's voice came through the CUM system. We're proceeding with standard protocol for dual trigger systems. Beginning disarmament sequence in 30 seconds. Sarah couldn't stay silent. Team Gamma, wait. There's a secondary mechanism you haven't identified. If you disable the primary triggers first, you'll activate the hidden system. The training area fell silent. Through her headset, Sarah could hear Lawrence's sharp intake of breath. On the monitors, she watched as Team Gamma paused their procedure, looking confused by the conflicting instructions. Chen, Lawrence's voice was dangerously quiet. Report to my office immediately. Team Gamma, continue your exercise. Ignore unauthorized communications. Sarah stood slowly, knowing she had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But as she left the monitoring station, she heard Walsh's voice over the CUM. Command, we're seeing some unusual wiring patterns here. Request permission to reassess before proceeding. The exercise was suspended for technical review. When the training devices were examined, Sarah's assessment proved correct. Team Gamma's standard approach would have triggered the hidden mechanism. But instead of vindication, Sarah found herself facing a disciplinary review that would determine whether she remained in the program at all. Lawrence's office felt smaller than usual, filled with the accumulated weight of disappointment and authority. Chen, in your 3 months with this unit, you have consistently demonstrated an inability to stay within your assigned parameters. Today's incident represents a fundamental breakdown in discipline and chain of command. Ma'am, I prevented a team from learning a potentially fatal approach. In a real situation, unauthorized communications can cause more chaos than they prevent. Bomb disposal teams rely on clear command structures and defined roles. When someone steps outside those roles, regardless of their intentions, they compromise the entire operation. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Ma'am, are you saying that identifying a missed threat was wrong? I'm saying that undermining established protocols because you think you know better is wrong. Your job was to observe and document, not to override trained technicians who were handling the situation appropriately. They weren't handling it appropriately. They were about to make a mistake that would have killed them. Lawrence leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that looked like pity. Chen, this is exactly what I mean. You second-guess experienced professionals. You insert yourself into situations where you don't belong, and you justify it by claiming everyone else is wrong and you're right. The words hit like physical blows. Sarah realized she was fighting, not just for her role in this incident, but for her entire future in bomb disposal. Ma'am, I'm not trying to undermine anyone. I'm trying to save lives. No, Chen, you're trying to prove that you're smarter than everyone else in the room. And that kind of ego is exactly what gets people killed in our line of work. Sarah sat in stunned silence as Lawrence opened her personnel file. Your technical scores are excellent, but your interpersonal evaluations consistently note issues with authority, excessive emotional investment, and difficulty working within established frameworks. Today's incident confirms that you're not suited for collaborative high-pressure work. What does that mean? It means we're recommending you for transfer to the research division. Your analytical skills would be valuable there, and you'd be working independently rather than as part of operational teams. Research division. Sarah had heard this phrase before, but now it sounded like exile. a place where her inconvenient insights could be safely contained, where her emotional investment in getting things right couldn't disrupt the smooth functioning of people who knew their place. "Ma'am, I request the opportunity to continue in field training. I believe I can contribute." "Chen, this isn't a negotiation. It's a reassignment based on your demonstrated inability to function effectively within team structures. The research division needs someone with your technical background, and you need an environment where your tendencies won't put others at risk." As Sarah left Lauren's office, she understood that her career in active bomb disposal was effectively over before it had begun. She would be transferred to a basement office where she could write reports and analyze case studies while others did the actual work of saving lives. The cruelest part was knowing that she had been right. Team Gamma would have failed in a real situation, and her intervention had prevented them from learning a fatal approach. But being right didn't matter if being right meant challenging the system that others depended on for order and clarity. Walking through the training facility that evening, Sarah realized she faced a choice that would define the rest of her career: accept the limitations others had placed on her abilities, or find a way to prove that sometimes the system itself was the problem. She didn't know that the opportunity to make that proof would come sooner than anyone expected, and that when it did, the system she'd been accused of undermining would desperately need the exact kind of thinking they'd tried to suppress. The final meeting in Chief Inspector Larson's office took place on a Thursday morning that began like any other, with Sarah completing equipment inventory while her former colleagues prepared for field certification exercises. She was no longer permitted to observe. The summons came at 10:30 a.m., delivered by Sergeant Williams with the kind of professional courtesy that masked underlying relief that an uncomfortable situation was finally being resolved. Sarah had known this moment was coming for 2 weeks, ever since the security protocol restrictions had effectively ended her ability to pursue advanced training. She'd spent those weeks completing her assigned duties with mechanical precision, while watching her access to meaningful work evaporate piece by piece. Now sitting across from Larson's desk for what she knew would be the last time, she felt a strange sense of clarity. "Chen," Larson began, consulting a folder that she assumed contained her transfer orders, "I want you to know that this decision wasn't made lightly. Your technical aptitude is undeniable, and in different circumstances, you might have been a valuable field operative. But not in these circumstances," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite the finality of the moment. "Not in these circumstances," Larson confirmed. "Bomb disposal work requires more than technical knowledge. It requires the ability to function as part of a team, to trust your colleagues' expertise, and to work within established frameworks even when you might prefer a different approach." Sarah had heard variations of this speech before, but today, it carried the weight of an official verdict. "And you believe I can't do those things? I believe you've demonstrated that you can't do those things." The incident 2 weeks ago wasn't an isolated event. It was the culmination of a pattern of behavior that shows you prioritize your own judgment over collective expertise and established protocols. Larson opened the folder and withdrew a set of documents that Sarah recognized as transfer paperwork. "The research division has specifically requested your assignment. Dr. Elizabeth van der Berk believes your analytical skills would be ideal for their work on predictive threat assessment and protocol development." Predictive threat assessment. Sarah almost smiled at the euphemism. She would be analyzing theoretical scenarios and writing reports that operational teams might consult if they had time and inclination. Her insights would be safely contained in academic exercises rather than applied to actual life and death situations. "Sir, I request the opportunity to remain in field training. I believe the recent incident demonstrates the value of multiple perspectives in complex scenarios." Larson's expression showed the patient disappointment of someone explaining reality to a person who refused to accept it. "Chen, this isn't about the value of your perspective. It's about your inability to express that perspective through appropriate channels at appropriate times. In bomb disposal, unauthorized communications don't just disrupt operations, they can cause the very disasters we're trying to prevent. What if the appropriate channels are insufficient? What if waiting for proper procedures means people die? The question hung in the air like smoke from a detonated device. Larson studied Sarah with eyes that had seen too. Many young officers struggle with the gap between idealism and operational reality. That, he said finally, is exactly the kind of thinking that makes you unsuitable for field work. You've convinced yourself that rules and procedures are obstacles to overcome rather than safeguards that keep everyone alive. In our line of work, that attitude is genuinely dangerous. Sarah felt something crystallize inside her, not anger, but a cold understanding of the fundamental divide that separated her from the people around her. They saw protocols as protection. She saw them as potential blindfolds. They valued predictability and collective consensus. She valued adaptability and individual insight. Neither perspective was wrong, but they were incompatible within the same operational framework. Chen, I need you to understand something. Larson's tone became more personal, almost fatherly. This transfer isn't punishment. It's recognition that your strengths lie in different areas than field operations. The research division needs people who can think outside conventional parameters, who can identify weaknesses in our approaches, who can develop new protocols for threats we haven't encountered yet. In other words, my perspective is valuable, as long as it's safely contained where it can't interfere with actual operations. Larson's pause told Sarah that her assessment was accurate, even if it wasn't diplomatic. I prefer to think of it as matching your skills to the role where they can be most effectively utilized. The transfer orders were comprehensive and immediate. Sarah would report to Dr. Vanderberg on Monday morning. Her security clearances would be adjusted to reflect her new role, maintaining access to case files and analytical materials while removing authorization for operational areas and real-time communications. She would have an office in the research building 3 blocks from the main counter-terrorism unit facility, where she could pursue the kind of detailed analysis that had gotten her into trouble when applied to active scenarios. Chen, I hope you understand that this decision is in everyone's best interest, Larson concluded, extending the transfer papers across his desk. You'll be working on important problems without the interpersonal complications that have made your time here difficult. Sarah accepted the papers without reading them. She knew what they contained, a detailed description of how her career in active bomb disposal was ending before it had properly begun. How her insights would be channeled into academic exercises instead of life-saving applications, how the system was protecting itself from the discomfort of someone who refused to accept its limitations. Sir, may I ask one question? Of course. If a situation arose where conventional approaches failed, where established protocols proved inadequate, where lives depended on someone thinking differently than they'd been trained to think, would you want that person to stay silent because they weren't authorized to speak? Larson considered the question for a long moment. Chen, in 30 years of bomb disposal work, I've learned that the situations that really matter are the ones we're training. Experience and protocols combine to provide the best chance of success. Individual brilliance is less important than collective competence. And if collective competence isn't enough, then we deal with the consequences and learn from them for next time. That's how we improve as a unit and as a profession. Sarah stood to leave, the transfer papers tucked under her arm like evidence of her failure to fit into a world she desperately wanted to join. As she reached the door, Larson spoke again. Chen, for what it's worth, I hope you find satisfaction in research work. Your technical knowledge really is exceptional. Sarah paused at the threshold, understanding that this was as close to an apology as she would receive. Thank you, sir. I hope the unit never faces a situation where Exceptional technical knowledge applied unconventionally would make the difference between success and catastrophe. Walking through the training facility for the last time, Sarah passed the equipment stations where she'd spent months learning to count and categorize while others learned to disarm and neutralize. She passed the briefing room where her questions had been redirected and her suggestions politely dismissed. She passed the monitoring station where her unauthorized intervention had sealed her fate as someone too disruptive for operational work. On Monday, she would begin her new career as a researcher, analyzing threats from a safe distance while others faced them directly. She would write reports about weaknesses in conventional approaches while being forbidden from applying that knowledge when lives hung in the balance. She would be valued for her insights as long as those insights remained theoretical rather than practical. What Sarah didn't know was that someone else had been conducting their own analysis of conventional bomb disposal approaches. Someone who understood that the greatest weakness of any system was its unwillingness to consider that its fundamental assumptions might be wrong. Someone who was about to create a device specifically designed to exploit that weakness. In 3 days, Sarah's theoretical knowledge and unconventional thinking would become the only thing standing between thousands of innocent people and a catastrophic proof that sometimes the people who don't fit the system are exactly who the system needs most. Dr. Elizabeth Vanderberg's research facility occupied the 3rd floor of a converted administrative building 3 blocks from the main Counter-Terrorism Unit headquarters. The office that Sarah had been assigned was small but well-equipped, with dual monitors for analyzing case files and a bookshelf that she'd already begun filling with the advanced texts that had gotten her into trouble at her previous assignment. It was Tuesday, her 2nd day in the research division, when the emergency alert system activated at 11:47 a.m. The sharp, insistent tone cut through the quiet hum of academic work, followed immediately by an automated announcement that made Sarah's blood turn cold. Code red emergency. All available personnel report to stations immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat. Code red emergency. All available personnel to stations. Sarah rushed to her window, which provided a partial view of the main CTU building. She could see vehicles racing in and out of the compound, emergency lights flashing, personnel running between buildings with the controlled urgency that indicated a genuine crisis rather than a training exercise. Dr. Vanderberg appeared in Sarah's doorway, her usually calm expression tight with concern. Chen, we're receiving reports of a major incident downtown. A device has been discovered at the European Parliament building during a routine security sweep. What kind of device? Sarah asked, already reaching for her jacket. Unknown at this time. The initial report suggests it's unlike anything our teams have encountered before. Complex, sophisticated, and Vanderberg paused, consulting her phone as new information arrived, and specifically designed to defeat standard disarmament protocols. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of scenario she'd studied in her private research, a device engineered to exploit conventional approaches. Dr. Vanderberg, I'd like to request permission to assist with analysis. My background in unconventional device configurations might be relevant. Chen, your research division now. Our role is to provide analytical support from here, not to interfere with field operations. Vanderberg's tone was gentle but firm. I'm sure the operational teams have everything under control. But even as she spoke, both women could hear the increasing urgency of radio communications from the main building. Through Sarah's window, they watched as additional emergency vehicles arrived, their lights painting the sunny Brussels morning in ominous reds and blues. The device had been discovered by a routine security team conducting a scheduled sweep of the Parliament building's lower levels. What they found was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, disguised as an explosive device, a mechanism that appeared to follow Conventional bomb-making principles while containing multiple layers of deception designed to trap anyone attempting. Standard disarmament procedures. At the CTU Command Center, Chief Inspector Larson stood before a wall of monitors displaying live feeds from the Parliament building. The device sat in a storage room 2 levels below the main assembly hall, its various components spread across a metal table like an elaborate puzzle. To experienced eyes, it looked sophisticated but manageable, the kind of challenge that required careful work but fell within established parameters. Initial assessment suggests a timer-based mechanism with multiple trigger systems, reported Marcus Hoffman, who was leading the analysis team. Standard protocol would be to identify the primary detonator, isolate the power source, then systematically disable the redundant triggers. Larson nodded, but something about the device's configuration troubled him. Time estimate for disarmament? 4 to 6 hours using conventional approaches. The device appears complex but follows recognizable patterns. We've handled similar configurations before. What neither Hoffman nor Larson understood was that the device's creator had studied those previous cases extensively. Every recognizable pattern was deliberately designed to trigger the exact response protocols that CTU teams had been trained to follow. The bomber wanted them to approach the device with confidence, to trust their experience, to follow procedures that would seem appropriate until the moment they proved catastrophically wrong. The first indication that conventional approaches might be inadequate came 45 minutes into the analysis phase. Team Alpha, working with advanced scanning equipment, discovered that the device contained components that didn't appear in their identification databases, materials, and mechanisms that suggested innovative construction techniques. Command: "We're seeing some unusual elements here," Hoffman reported over the radio. "The primary trigger system appears to be standard configuration, but there are secondary components that don't match our reference materials." Unknown components? Larson's voice carried the edge of someone whose confidence was beginning to erode. Affirmative. The scanning equipment shows additional circuitry that doesn't correspond to any known device patterns. It's possible we're dealing with a hybrid design that combines multiple explosive traditions. In the research facility, Sarah was monitoring CTU communications through an emergency broadcast system that allowed research division personnel to follow major incidents in real time. As she listened to the evolving reports, a cold certainty began to settle in her stomach. The device description matched several case studies she'd analyzed in her private research. Bombs specifically engineered to defeat experienced disposal teams by exploiting their reliance on pattern recognition and standard protocols. These weren't random modifications or amateur innovations. They were carefully designed psychological traps that used a bomb disposal team's own expertise against them. "Dr. Vanderberg," Sarah said, turning from her monitoring station, "I need to call the command center. I believe this device is designed to exploit standard disarmament protocols. Chen, our role is observation and analysis, not operational intervention. But if I'm right about the device configuration, the teams are walking into a trap. Every standard approach they try could trigger additional mechanisms they haven't identified yet." Vanderberg looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed concern with wariness. "Chen, you've been in research division for 2 days. You don't have access to the detailed intelligence that the operational teams are working with. I have access to historical case studies that suggest this type of device has been used before. The pattern recognition approach that makes our teams effective also makes them predictable to someone who understands their training." Through the window, Sarah could see additional emergency vehicles arriving at the main CTU building. The response was escalating, which meant the initial assessment teams were encountering problems that exceeded their standard capabilities. "Dr. Vanderberg, please. Let me at least share my analysis with the command center. If I'm wrong, they can dismiss If I'm right, it could save lives. Vanderberg studied Sarah carefully, clearly weighing the potential consequences of authorizing or refusing the request. The sound of emergency sirens grew louder outside, a reminder that whatever was happening at the Parliament building was far from routine. Chen, if I allow you to contact the command center, you'll be stepping outside research protocols just days after being transferred here for similar behavior. Are you certain this is worth the risk to your career? Sarah looked through her window at the emergency vehicles, thinking about the disposal teams who were probably approaching the device with confidence in their training and experience. Teams who had no way of knowing that their expertise was exactly what the bomber was counting on. Dr. Vanderberg, some things are more important than career advancement. If there's any chance I can help prevent a catastrophe, I have to try. What Sarah didn't know was that at that very moment, Team Alpha was preparing to begin the disarmament sequence that the device had been specifically designed to exploit. In 30 minutes, their first attempt to follow standard protocol would trigger a cascade of events that would prove conventional bomb disposal thinking catastrophically inadequate. The clock was already ticking toward the moment when Sarah's unconventional knowledge would become the only thing standing between thousands of people and a bomber's proof that expertise could be its own weakness. Dr. Vanderberg's authorization came with strict conditions. Sarah could provide analytical input to the command center, but only through official research division channels, and only if her insights remained advisory rather than operational. Sarah accepted the limitations, knowing that any contribution was better than watching a potential disaster unfold from her office window. The command center buzzed with controlled intensity when Sarah arrived via the connecting tunnel between buildings. Wall-mounted screens displayed live feeds from the Parliament building, technical schematics of the device, and real-time updates from multiple analysis teams. Chief Inspector Larson stood at the center of the controlled chaos, coordinating between field teams, technical specialists, and government officials whose faces bore the strain of a crisis that was rapidly exceeding normal parameters. Dr. Vanderberg, Larson acknowledged as the research team entered. I understand you have analytical input regarding the device configuration. Specialist Chen has identified historical patterns that may be relevant to current disarmament strategies. Vanderberg replied carefully. We're here to provide research support, not operational guidance. Sarah stepped forward, consulting the notes she'd prepared during the brief walk between buildings. Sir, the device configuration matches several cases from my historical analysis specifically. Bombs designed to exploit standard disposal protocols by appearing conventional while containing hidden trap mechanisms. Larson's expression showed polite attention mixed with skepticism. Chen, our teams have 30 years of combined experience with exotic devices. They're conducting systematic analysis using proven methodologies. Sir, that's exactly the problem. The historical cases suggest these devices are engineered to defeat systematic analysis and proven methodologies. They're designed to make experienced teams overconfident by presenting familiar patterns that mask unfamiliar dangers. On the main display screen, Team Alpha could be seen working methodically around the device. Their leader, Marcus Hoffman, was conducting preliminary identification procedures with the calm efficiency that had made him the unit's most trusted field operative. To experienced observers, his approach looked textbook perfect, careful, systematic, and grounded in established protocols. Team Alpha, status report, Larson requested over the communication system. Primary analysis complete. Hoffman's voice came through the speakers with characteristic confidence. We've identified a timer-based mechanism with dual trigger redundancy. Standard protocol indicates we should isolate the primary power source, then systematically disable the backup triggers. Estimated completion time, 90 minutes. Sarah felt her stomach clench. Sir, if this follows the historical pattern, Isolating the primary power source will activate hidden mechanisms that aren't visible in standard scanning. The device wants them to follow standard protocol. Chen, Larson's tone carried the patient authority of someone explaining reality to a person who refused to accept it. Our teams use advanced scanning equipment that can identify concealed components. If there were hidden mechanisms, we would have detected them. Sir, the historical cases show that these devices use materials and configurations specifically designed to avoid detection by standard scanning equipment. They're engineered to be invisible until activated by conventional disarmament attempts. Deputy Chief Laurent, who had been monitoring communications from multiple agencies, approached Larson with an expression of growing concern. Inspector, we're receiving pressure from Parliament security to accelerate the timeline. There's a legislative session scheduled for this afternoon, and officials are asking about evacuation protocols. Larson nodded grimly. Team Alpha, be advised that we need to expedite the disarmament process. Political considerations are adding pressure to the timeline. Sarah realized with growing horror that the exact conditions the bomber had wanted were falling into place. Experienced teams working under time pressure, following proven protocols, with political authorities demanding rapid resolution. Every element that made CTU effective in normal situations was becoming a vulnerability in this carefully orchestrated trap. Sir, Sarah said, her voice carrying an urgency that made several people turn toward her. Please ask the teams to delay standard protocol and conduct additional scanning for non-conventional materials. If I'm right about the device design, their first attempt at power isolation will trigger catastrophic failure. Larson studied Sarah with an expression that mixed irritation with consideration. Around them, the command center continued its efficient operation, but Sarah could sense that her warning was being weighed against time pressure and operational necessity. Team Alpha, Larson finally said into his communication system. Before beginning disarmament, conduct additional scanning for unconventional materials and hidden trigger mechanisms. Hoffman's response carried the slight edge of someone whose professional judgment was being questioned. Command, we've completed comprehensive scanning using standard protocols. The device shows no indication of concealed components beyond the identified trigger systems. Roger, Team Alpha, proceed with standard disarmament protocol. Sarah watched the main display screen with a mixture of hope and dread as Hoffman approached the device's primary power source. His movements were confident and precise, exactly as he'd been trained. He positioned his tools carefully, double-checked his approach against established procedures, and began the isolation sequence that CTU teams had successfully used hundreds of times before. The explosion, when it came, wasn't the massive detonation that would have destroyed the Parliament building. Instead, it was a controlled blast designed to destroy the disarmament team while leaving the main device intact and even more dangerous than before. The screens went white with static as the surveillance equipment was destroyed, then switched to backup cameras that showed smoke filling the storage room and emergency lights casting everything in hellish red illumination. Team Alpha, respond. Larson's voice cut through the sudden chaos in the command center. Team Alpha, status report. The silence that followed was broken only by the hiss of static and the sound of emergency alarms from the Parliament building. After 30 seconds that felt like hours, a weak voice came through the communication system. Command ... Team Alpha. We have casualties. Hoffman is down, unconscious but breathing. Rodriguez has a concussion and possible internal injuries. The device. Command, the device is still active, but it's changed. The explosion revealed additional components we didn't detect in initial scanning. The main screen switched to emergency, lighting footage that showed a scene of controlled devastation. The device sat in the center of the storage room, but now additional panels had opened to reveal circuitry and mechanisms that hadn't been visible during the original analysis. What had appeared to be a sophisticated but manageable bomb had transformed into something far more complex and dangerous. "Sir," came the voice of the backup team leader, "we need immediate medical evacuation for Team Alpha, and we need to reassess our approach completely. This device is unlike anything in our databases." Larson stood in the suddenly quiet command center, surrounded by screens showing a trap that had been sprung exactly as designed. Around him, experienced professionals struggled to process that their most trusted approaches had not only failed, but had made the situation dramatically worse. Sarah felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. Everything she'd feared about the device had proven accurate, but being right felt like the most bitter victory imaginable. 2 of her former colleagues were injured. The bomb was more dangerous than ever, and the conventional approaches that everyone trusted had been revealed as potentially fatal weaknesses. "Dr. van der Berg," Larson said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose assumptions about the world had just been shattered. "I think we need to hear more about those historical cases." Sarah stepped forward, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether her unconventional knowledge could save lives or whether the bomber's proof that expertise could be manipulated would claim thousands of victims. The device was still active, still counting down, and now everyone knew that everything they'd been trained to trust might be exactly wrong. The medical evacuation of Team Alpha took 12 critical minutes, during which the device remained active and everyone in the command center struggled to process what had just happened. Marcus Hoffman was unconscious with severe concussion and possible internal bleeding. Rodriguez was conscious but disoriented, his testimony about the explosion fragmented and contradictory. The backup team had established a secure perimeter around the device, but was afraid to approach it, knowing that their standard assessment procedures had already proved catastrophically inadequate. Sarah stood before the main display screen, studying the transformed device with a mixture of professional fascination and growing dread. The explosion had revealed the bomb's true nature. What had appeared to be a conventional timer-based mechanism was actually an elaborate psychological trap designed to evolve and become more dangerous each time standard disarmament protocols were attempted. "Chen," Chief Inspector Larson said, his voice carrying none of its usual authority, "tell me about those historical cases." Sarah consulted her notes, aware that every eye in the command center was now focused on her. "Sir, there have been 7 documented cases over the past 15 years of devices specifically engineered to defeat experienced bomb disposal teams. They all follow similar patterns. They present familiar configurations that encourage standard approaches, then use those approaches to activate additional mechanisms that make the device more complex and dangerous. Why haven't we heard about these cases?" Deputy Chief Laurent asked. "Because they were classified as terrorist innovations rather than systematic psychological warfare. Each incident was analyzed independently, and the pattern was never officially recognized." Sarah moved to the tactical display, pointing to specific components of the revealed device. "But the pattern is clear. These bombs are designed by people who understand bomb disposal psychology as well as bomb disposal technology." Larson studied the screen, his expression grim. "What's the bomber's objective?" "To prove that expertise can be manipulated. These devices aren't primarily intended to cause maximum casualties. They're intended to demonstrate that conventional thinking is a vulnerability that can be exploited." Sarah paused, knowing her next words would be difficult to hear. "Sir, the bomber wants to prove that experienced teams are more dangerous than inexperienced ones, because experienced teams trust their training even when their training is being used against them." The silence in the command center was broken by an incoming communication from the backup team leader. "Command, we're detecting additional timer mechanisms that weren't visible before the explosion. The device appears to be on an accelerated countdown. We're showing approximately 3 hours until detonation." 3 hours. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized the bomber had anticipated even this development. The failed disarmament attempt hadn't just revealed additional mechanisms, it had shortened the available time for whatever came next. Sir, Sarah continued, the historical analysis suggests that these devices can't be disarmed using conventional approaches. Every standard protocol becomes a trap that makes the situation worse. The only successful neutralizations came from teams that abandoned established procedures entirely. What kind of unconventional approaches? Larson asked. Sarah had hoped someone wouldn't ask that question. Sir, the successful cases involved techniques that would be considered highly irregular by CTU standards, working backward from the explosive rather than forward from the triggers, disabling components in non-standard sequences, using tools and approaches that aren't covered in official training. You're describing exactly the kind of improvisation that gets people killed, Laurent observed. Ma'am, with respect, conventional approaches just got 2 of our people seriously injured and made the device more dangerous. At what point do we acknowledge that following the rules is exactly what the bomber wants us to do? The question hung in the air like smoke from the Parliament building explosion. Around them, experienced professionals who had built their careers on systematic approaches and proven methodologies struggled with the possibility that their expertise was being used as a weapon against them. Chen, Larson said finally, hypothetically, if we were to consider unconventional approaches, what would you recommend? Sarah had spent months preparing for this exact question, though she'd never imagined it would come under these circumstances. Sir, I would need to examine the device directly. The historical cases suggest that each bomb has unique vulnerabilities that can only be identified through close analysis using non-standard assessment techniques. You want to go into the Parliament building, Laurent said, her tone making it clear this was an impossibility rather than a suggestion. Ma'am, I want to save thousands of lives using knowledge that nobody else in this room possesses. The device was designed to defeat every person currently qualified for bomb disposal work. It wasn't designed to defeat someone who approaches the problem from directions that conventional training doesn't consider. Larson looked at the display screen, where the countdown timer showed 2 hours and 47 minutes remaining. Around the device, sophisticated scanning equipment lay destroyed or damaged, testament to the bomber's understanding of how CTU teams operated and what tools they relied on. Chen, even if I were willing to consider this request, you're not certified for field work. You're research division personnel with no authorization for hazardous operations. Sir, I'm the only person in this building who has studied these specific device types, and the only person whose approach hasn't been anticipated by the bomber. Authorization or not, I'm the closest thing to an expert on unconventional bomb disposal. Techniques that we currently have available. Dr. van der Berk, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. Inspector, Specialist Chen's theoretical knowledge is extensive, but theory and fieldwork are different disciplines. The research division can't authorize her for operational assignments. Sarah felt frustration building. Even now, with conventional approaches proven disastrously inadequate and time running out, the system was more concerned with authorization and protocol than with finding solutions that might actually work. Sir, she said, looking directly at Larson, in the historical cases, successful teams were often led by people who weren't supposed to be there. Junior technicians who tried approaches their supervisors wouldn't have approved. Specialists from other disciplines who saw problems differently than trained bomb disposal experts. The common factor wasn't authorization, it was the willingness to think beyond established limitations. The command center fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of emergency vehicles. On the screen, the countdown continued its relentless progress toward a detonation that would prove the bomber's point in the most devastating way possible. Chen, Larson said quietly, if I were to hypothetically authorize your involvement, what exactly are you proposing? Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized this was actually being considered. "Sir, I'm proposing to analyze the device using techniques that aren't covered in conventional training. To approach it as a psychological puzzle rather than a technical problem. To think like someone trying to defeat bomb disposal experts rather than thinking like a bomb disposal expert. And you believe this approach would be successful?" "Sir, I believe it's the only approach that hasn't already been proven catastrophically inadequate." Larson studied her for a long moment, weighing her unconventional expertise against every regulation, protocol, and safety measure that normally governed CTU operations. Around them, the command center waited for a decision that would either save thousands of lives or add another casualty to the bomber's psychological warfare campaign. "Dr. van der Berg," Larson said finally, "I need to know, do you believe Chen's theoretical knowledge could translate into practical solutions?" Sarah held her breath as her supervisor considered a question that would determine whether her months of preparation had been worthwhile, or whether she would watch from the sidelines as conventional wisdom failed catastrophically. The countdown timer showed 2 hours and 41 minutes, and every second of delay brought thousands of innocent people closer to becoming proof that sometimes the people who don't fit the system are exactly who the system needs most. Dr. van der Berg's response carried the careful precision of someone whose words would be scrutinized and second-guessed regardless of the outcome. "Inspector, Specialist Chen's theoretical knowledge is comprehensive, and her analysis of historical cases appears accurate. However, fieldwork involves variables that can't be predicted through academic study." "That's not what I asked," Larson replied, his tone sharpening with time pressure and desperation. "I asked whether you believe her knowledge could translate into practical solutions." The question forced everyone in the command center to confront an uncomfortable reality. They were considering authorizing someone with no field certification to attempt something that had already seriously injured two experienced operatives. The decision violated every safety protocol and chain of command principle that normally governed CTU operations. "Sir," van der Berg said finally, "Chen's approach represents our best theoretical understanding of these device types. Whether that translates to practical success is unknown, but—" She paused, glancing at the countdown timer. "Our conventional approaches have proven inadequate." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude mixed with terror. Van der Berg was supporting her request while maintaining plausible deniability, exactly the Cullade kind of political maneuvering that might make Larson's authorization possible. "Inspector," came a voice from the communications station, "we're receiving pressure from Parliament Security for updated timeline estimates. They're asking whether evacuation protocols should be activated." Larson looked at the main display, where the transformed device sat in its storage room like a technological demonstration of conventional wisdom's limitations. Around it, scanning equipment lay destroyed, testament to how thoroughly the bomber had anticipated standard CTU responses. "Chen," Larson said, "if I authorize your involvement, you'll be working under conditions that violate every safety protocol in our manual. No backup team, no conventional support, no established procedures to fall back on if you're unconventional. Approaches fail. Sir, if conventional approaches were adequate, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And if your unconventional approaches fail, you'll be dead and we'll have lost our only alternative to evacuation." Sarah understood the mathematics of the situation. The device was designed to defeat experienced teams using standard protocols. Those teams had failed exactly as predicted, proving the bomber's psychological warfare concepts while shortening the available time for alternative approaches. Now everyone was being forced to choose between trusting someone unqualified for fieldwork or accepting that thousands of people would need to be evacuated because the experts had been systematically outmaneuvered. "Sir," Sarah said, "I understand the risks, But I also understand that this device represents a test of whether our thinking can adapt faster than the bomber's psychology can anticipate. So far, the bomber is winning because we've responded exactly as predicted. Deputy Chief Laurent approached Larson with a communication device. Inspector, Parliament Security is reporting that full evacuation would require 6 to 8 hours to complete safely. We don't have that time. The implication was clear. If the device couldn't be neutralized, the choice was between accepting massive casualties or attempting the kind of unauthorized solution that could end careers even if it succeeded. Chen, Larson said, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a decision that would define the remainder of his career. Describe exactly what you're proposing to do. Sarah had rehearsed this explanation in her mind dozens of times, but now speaking it aloud with lives hanging in the balance, the words felt both inadequate and crucial. Sir, I propose to analyze the device using psychological rather than technical assessment. Instead of identifying components and following disarmament protocols, I would study the bomber's intentions and work backward from their psychological objectives to identify approaches they haven't anticipated. That sounds like improvisation rather than methodology. Sir, it is improvisation rather than methodology. The historical cases suggest that these devices can only be defeated by people willing to abandon methodology entirely. Larson looked around the command center, studying the faces of experienced professionals who had spent decades building expertise that was now proving worse than useless. The bombing had transformed their knowledge into a liability and their experience into a weakness that could be exploited. Chen, you're asking me to authorize the most irregular operation in CTU, history based on theoretical analysis and historical cases that weren't even officially recognized as a pattern. Sir, I'm asking you to authorize the only approach that hasn't already been proven inadequate. The communication station crackled with another update from the backup team. Command, we're detecting additional changes in the device configuration. Components are still shifting, and the countdown appears to be accelerating. Current estimate shows 2 hours and 28 minutes remaining. Sarah felt time pressure building like water behind a dam. Every minute of discussion brought the detonation closer, while the device continued evolving in ways that would make even unconventional approaches more difficult. Inspector, she said, the historical cases show that these devices become more sophisticated over time. The longer we delay, the more the bomber's psychological traps adapt to potential solutions. If we're going to attempt an unconventional approach, we need to do it before the device evolves beyond anyone's ability to understand it. Larson stood silent for nearly 30 seconds, weighing Sarah's request against every principle of safe bomb disposal practice. Around him, the command center waited for a decision that would either validate years of unconventional thinking or confirm that some problems couldn't be solved by people who refused to accept limitations. Chen, Larson said finally, I cannot authorize you for field work. You're not certified, not qualified, and not officially equipped for hazardous operations. Sarah felt her heart sink as the formal rejection confirmed what she'd feared. The system would protect its protocols, even when those protocols proved inadequate. However, Larson continued, Dr. van der Berk has authorization to designate research personnel for analytical field support in extreme circumstances. If she were to make such a designation, and if that designation coincidentally involved close examination of the device in question. The implication was clear. Larson couldn't authorize what Sarah was proposing, but he could create bureaucratic cover for someone else to make that authorization. It was the kind of institutional flexibility that occurred only when conventional options had been exhausted and careers mattered less than lives. Dr. van der Berk, Sarah said, turning to her supervisor, I formally request designation for analytical field support. Van der Berk looked at Sarah, then at Larson, then at the countdown. Timer that showed 2 hours and 26 minutes remaining. Specialist Chen, you're authorized for advanced analytical assessment of the device in question, using whatever research methodologies you determine appropriate. The authorization was so irregular it bordered on fiction, but it provided the legal framework for Sarah to attempt something that everyone knew was either brilliant or suicidal. She would be working alone, without backup, using approaches that violated every safety protocol in the CTU manual. Chen, Larson said, you have 2 hours to prove that unconventional thinking can succeed where conventional expertise failed. If you're wrong, thousands of people will pay the price for our willingness to trust someone who doesn't fit our normal parameters. Sarah nodded, understanding that she was about to become either the person who saved Brussels or the person whose overconfidence had prevented a proper evacuation. There was no middle ground, no partial success, no opportunity to claim that good intentions mattered more than results. As she prepared to leave for the Parliament building, Sarah realized that everything she'd studied, every technique she'd developed, every insight she'd gained through months of preparation was about to be tested against a device specifically designed to defeat people exactly like her. The bomber had anticipated conventional thinking. But had they anticipated someone whose thinking was so unconventional that she'd been exiled from normal operations? In less than 2 hours, Brussels would discover whether being too different for the system was exactly what the system needed most. The Parliament building's lower storage level felt like descending into the mechanical heart of European democracy. Sarah moved through corridors lined with backup power systems and archived documents, her footsteps echoing off concrete walls. As she approached the room where conventional wisdom had already failed twice, the emergency lighting cast everything in harsh red shadows, making the destroyed scanning equipment look like battlefield casualties. The device sat in the center of the storage room, its additional panels now open to reveal circuitry that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. Sarah could see why Marcus had approached it with confidence from a conventional perspective. It looked sophisticated but manageable. "Chen, this is Command," came Larson's voice through her earpiece. "We're showing 1 hour and 47 minutes remaining. Status report. Beginning unconventional analysis," Sarah replied, setting down her equipment bag and pulling out tools that weren't standard CTU issue. Instead of advanced scanning devices, she carried a magnifying glass, notebook, digital camera, and basic multimeter. Her approach would be observational rather than technological. The first thing Sarah noticed was what the device wanted her to notice. The timer display was prominently positioned, counting down with hypnotic precision. The primary trigger mechanisms were clearly visible, practically begging for a trained technician to begin standard disarmament procedures. Everything about the device's presentation said, "Start here, follow protocol, trust your training." Sarah turned away from the obvious elements and began studying the device from angles that conventional training didn't consider. She photographed it from above, below, and both sides, looking for psychological tells rather than technical specifications. The bomber was trying to communicate with disposal teams through device design. What was the intended message? "Command, I'm seeing evidence of deliberate misdirection," Sarah reported. "The device is designed to focus attention on specific components while concealing others. The bomber wants us to see certain elements first." "Chen, what do you mean by misdirection?" "Sir, conventional training teaches us to identify the most dangerous components first. This device makes certain components appear most dangerous while hiding the actual critical systems." Sarah moved closer, studying wire patterns that seemed random until viewed as intentional camouflage. The breakthrough came when Sarah stopped trying to understand how the bomb worked and started trying to understand why it was designed the way it was. Every visible component served dual purposes: functional bomb-making and psychological manipulation. The timer wasn't just counting down to detonation, it was creating time pressure that forced conventional thinking. "Command, I believe I've identified the bomber's psychological strategy," Sarah said, her voice carrying growing confidence. This device doesn't just defeat conventional approaches, it requires conventional approaches to function properly. The bomber needs us to follow standard protocol to complete the weapon's design. Explain. Sir, I think this bomb can only detonate if we try to disarm it conventionally. The unauthorized approach isn't just different, it's the only approach that prevents the device from achieving its intended function. Sarah realized she was holding her breath. In 53 minutes, she would either prove that thinking differently could save thousands of lives, or she would become the final victim of a psychological trap designed to exploit the very unconventional thinking she represented. The device pulsed quietly in the emergency lighting, waiting for her to make a choice. That would define whether being too different for the system was Brussels' salvation or its ultimate vulnerability. Sarah's hands moved with deliberate precision as she implemented the most irregular bomb disposal approach in CTU history. Instead of following standard protocol, she was working backward from the explosive components toward the triggers, treating the device as a psychological puzzle rather than a technical problem. Command, I'm beginning disarmament using reverse sequence methodology, she reported, knowing that what she was about to attempt would sound like controlled insanity to everyone. Monitoring her progress. Chen, clarify reverse sequence, came Larson's tense reply. Sir, instead of disabling triggers to prevent detonation, I'm modifying the explosive components to prevent the triggers from having anything to detonate. Sarah carefully removed a panel that conventional analysis had identified as secondary importance. Beneath it, she found the device's actual heart, a sophisticated timing mechanism that coordinated multiple explosive charges. The psychological breakthrough had led to technical insight. The bomber wanted disposal teams to focus on obvious trigger mechanisms while ignoring the coordination system that made those triggers effective. By approaching the problem from the direction conventional training specifically warned against, Sarah was accessing components that standard protocols would never reach. 34 minutes remaining. Came the update from Command. Sarah worked steadily, photographing each step and narrating her approach for post-incident analysis. The device's coordination system was elegant in its complexity, multiple timers linked together in a cascade that would ensure detonation even if individual components were disabled. But the system's sophistication was also its weakness. It required precise timing relationships that could be disrupted by changing the sequence in which components activated. Command, I'm identifying multiple coordination timers that aren't visible in conventional scanning. The device uses synchronized detonation sequences that can be disrupted by introducing timing delays in specific components. Chen, are you saying you can disable the device without disarming the triggers? Sir, I'm saying the triggers are irrelevant. If the explosive components can't coordinate their detonation sequence. Sarah carefully adjusted timing mechanisms, creating delays that would prevent synchronized activation. It was like conducting an orchestra by slightly detuning individual instruments. The music couldn't function if the timing relationships were disrupted. The most critical moment came with 8 minutes remaining. Sarah had successfully introduced timing delays in 6 of the device's coordination systems, but the 7th was protected by a mechanism that activated if tampered with incorrectly. One wrong move would trigger immediate detonation. Command, I need complete silence for the next 3 minutes, Sarah said, her voice steady despite hands that trembled slightly with adrenaline. This was the moment everything came down to: unconventional thinking versus a bomber's psychological trap. Sarah closed her eyes and visualized the device's coordination system. Instead of following standard procedures, she thought about what the bomber wanted her to do, then did exactly the opposite. Where conventional training said move slowly, she moved quickly. Where protocols demanded multiple checks, she trusted her first instinct. The final coordination timer clicked into position with 47 seconds remaining on the primary countdown. Sarah held her breath as the device's multiple timers began. displaying conflicting information. Their synchronized detonation sequence, disrupted by the timing delay she'd introduced. 20 seconds. 15, 10. Command, device neutralized, Sarah said as the countdown reached 0 and nothing happened. The bomb's coordination system, deprived of synchronized timing, failed to trigger any explosive components. Emergency sirens continued wailing, but Sarah could hear something else through her earpiece. Applause from the CTU command center. She had proven that unconventional thinking could succeed where conventional expertise failed. That being too different for the system was exactly what the system needed when everything else broke down. "Chen," came Larson's voice, carrying emotion she'd never heard from him before. "Outstanding work. Medical teams are en route to your position." Sarah sat on the storage room floor, surrounded by the components of a device that had been designed to prove conventional thinking was fatally flawed. Instead, she had proven that sometimes the people who don't fit conventional parameters are the ones who save everyone else when conventional parameters prove inadequate. Brussels was safe, and Sarah Chen had just redefined what CDU thought they knew about unconventional solutions to impossible problems. 6 months after the Parliament incident, Sarah stood in the same briefing room where she'd once been dismissed as too emotional for field work, but everything had changed. The patch on her shoulder now read Advanced Threat Analysis Division. And when she spoke, experienced bomb disposal specialists from across Europe took careful notes. The Brussels device represents a new category of psychological warfare, Sarah explained to the assembled international task force. These bombs aren't just intended to cause casualties. They're designed to prove that our expertise can be turned against us. Standard protocols become vulnerabilities when dealing with bombers who understand our training as well as we do. Chief Inspector Larson, now her direct supervisor in the Advanced Threat Analysis Division, nodded approvingly from the front row. The unit he'd created specifically around Sarah's unconventional expertise had become CTU's most requested resource for cases involving innovative or psychologically sophisticated devices. Specialist Chen asked Colonel Martinez from the Spanish National Police, "How do we train teams to think unconventionally without abandoning the protocols that keep them safe in routine situations?" It was exactly the kind of question Sarah had hoped someone would ask. "Colonel, we don't abandon conventional training. We supplement it with psychological analysis and adaptive thinking exercises. Teams need to recognize when conventional approaches are being anticipated and exploited by sophisticated adversaries." The program Sarah had developed was spreading throughout European bomb disposal units. Her systematic approach to unconventional thinking, the same analytical methodology that had gotten her exiled from field work, was now being studied and implemented by teams that had once dismissed her as unsuitable for high-pressure operations. Marcus Hoffman, fully recovered from his injuries and now part of Sarah's advanced threat analysis team, raised his hand. "Sarah, what advice would you give to specialists who feel their unconventional insights aren't being heard by conventional command structures?" Sarah smiled at the question, remembering her own months of frustration and dismissal. "Prepare anyway. Study everything. Develop your expertise even when no one asks you to. Because someday, conventional approaches will prove inadequate, and the system will desperately need people who think differently." After the briefing, Sarah walked through the CTU facility that had once felt like exile. Now colleagues sought her input on complex cases. Her research was mandatory reading for bomb disposal trainees, and her methods were being taught alongside conventional protocols rather than dismissed as dangerous innovation. The irony wasn't lost on her that being too emotional for conventional bomb disposal work had prepared her perfectly for the psychological dimension of modern terrorist threats. Her emotional investment in understanding bombers' motivations had provided insights that purely technical training couldn't match. "Chen," came a familiar voice. Dr. Vanderberg approached with a folder containing Sarah's latest research proposals. The European Security Council has approved your request for expanded psychological profiling resources. You'll have whatever you need to stay ahead of these evolving threats. Sarah accepted the folder, knowing it represented something unprecedented. Official recognition that unconventional thinking wasn't just tolerated, but essential for protecting people from adversaries who understood conventional thinking well enough to exploit it. As she returned to her office, Sarah passed new trainees working through scenarios that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago, exercises that required them to abandon standard protocols and develop creative solutions to problems designed to defeat conventional approaches. Transformation was complete. Sarah Chen had evolved from being too different for bomb disposal work to being exactly the kind of different that bomb disposal work required. She'd proven that limitations imposed by others' perceptions could be overcome by preparation, persistence, and the willingness to be right. When everyone else preferred to be comfortable, her phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Another sophisticated device discovered in Amsterdam, another case where conventional approaches had failed. Another opportunity to prove that sometimes the people who don't fit the system are precisely who the system needs. When everything goes wrong, Sarah gathered her equipment and smiled. Some days, being too different to matter meant being exactly different enough to save everyone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.